Davis, lover of students, lover of life, a man of integrity, definitely loves music. I even found this out recently that he kind of gets with the garage bands, and he's the rhythm section for the bands. He gets together with the guys every now and then. But he loves music, loves life, and even more so loves students and sharing. So without further ado, this discussion was brought up a few months ago between him and I, and he brought Muhammad Ali, one of my favorite people, to watch the change and metamorphosis of this person. And we'll talk about that today, I'm sure. But a person who, man, at some points, people didn't really like him. And then before, people start to like him. And then when he passed away, I saw so many people that, was so, he was missed by so many people. And people knew that he was definitely an icon and a man before his time. And there's very few people like that. I know Professor Davis may even say some other names of people like Muhammad Ali, who's changed generations, over the generations, changed people to understand that we're all here for each other and should be here for each other. But without further ado, I'm gonna introduce to you Professor Steve Davis, over 37 years at Lone Star College-Kingwood. Steve?
Oh, well, thanks so much, Al, for that introduction. And anyway, we'll jump right in here, because I want to, that Muhammad Ali had a remarkable life, and he was a hero to me. And I titled that the talk today, Muhammad Ali and Me, because there'll be a kind of a personal element here in terms of my recollections. I don't know how many of you, who are going to be listening can actually remember Cassius Clay, who became Muhammad Ali when he was a fighter. But man, I saw almost every single fight of his, if I could, if it were telecast or whatever. And if I didn't see it, I was following the news very, very closely. So let's get going with that in terms of who he was. He was born in January of 1942. This interesting name here, Cassius Marcellus Clay. Let me get my slide to advance. There he is here. How old he is in that picture, I mentioned maybe 13 or 14 years old. And the story was that in his hometown of Louisville, when he was 12, somebody stole his bicycle. He had a Schwinn bicycle that was really a prized possession, and he was just beside himself, enraged that bicycle got taken. And there was a kindly police officer who saw, that he was so mad and he wanted to get even on somebody. He said, "I'll tell you what, rather than just kind of be angry without any kind of anything good resulting, why don't you come to the gym and let's see if we can, give you some boxing lessons and see if that will channel some of your emotions." And so once he was in the gym, it was obvious that he had natural talent as far as boxing was concerned. We first heard of him, most of us, in 1960, when you see the date there in the Olympics, which were held in Rome that year. That again, as Cassius Clay, he'll be Cassius Clay for much of this talk. He won the gold medal in boxing as a light heavyweight. He hadn't fully grown at that time. Light heavies come in at about 180 pounds. So you see him here standing at attention during the medal ceremony. The man on the right there is the Polish fighter that he defeated for the gold medal in the final. The two guys on the other side are the bronze medal winners. They don't make those guys fight it off. They just give each of them a medal. They had obviously been beaten in the semifinals by these two right here. There was a great sprinter from Tennessee State who won several gold medals in that Olympics. Her name was Wilma Rudolph. She said that Cassius Clay was all over the Olympic Village. He talked all the time that he slept with that medal. He was so proud of what he had won. As a matter of fact, going to Rome was the first time he'd ever flown. He had traveled some in the United States in the Golden Gloves, but he was so afraid of flying that he actually purchased a parachute and wore a parachute on the plane, if you can believe that. So at any rate, that was his kind of a debut as far as any kind of national recognition would be. And right after that, he started a pro career, probably was indeed before the end of 1960. And here we see him at a signing. We see his parents off to the side there. That's Odessa Clay and Cassius Marcellus Clay Sr. And the other guys, these white men around him, are all part of the Louisville sponsoring group, the LSG. There were 11 of them. They were rich men from Kentucky. And basically, they decided to invest in Cassius Clay. They saw this as a money-making proposition to take the young man under their wing and to line up some good some good trainers and the like. And the deal was they would pay for all the travel and the expenses and the like. And then as far as any profits down the road were concerned, they would be split 50-50. And, I think they ended up making a fair amount of money given the way they had to put their bet on somebody who was going to rise in the ranks. Now, it smacks kind of a slavery days in a way, guys. These are rich, paternalistic white men. They're trying to do what they think is the right thing. And I think they were better for Cassius Clay than a lot of other boxers. Didn't have this kind of backing, and they came to be controlled by organized crime, and that led to some of the very bad consequences. So they put him together with a trainer named Angelo Dundee, who was a expert on boxing and bringing up young fighters. And you can see the other side of the glass there. It's the Fifth Street Gym in Miami, where he was training. You even have him wearing a T-shirt. It looks kind of like the Coca-Cola logo. And the Angelo Dundee will play an incredibly important role in his up-and-coming boxing career. Now, he stayed in a hotel in another part of Miami that was 5 miles away from the gym. And every morning he would get in some of his road work by running to the gym the 5 miles, and he would shadow box the whole way. And one day there was a cop, a white cop, who saw him and thought he looked kind of suspicious or dangerous, looked kind of crazy or something, and quote unquote pulled him over. The cop wanted to talk to him and thought he might take him to jail. And he said he was with Angelo Dundee at the gym, and the cop put in a call and got that verified. So, like so many other young black men, Cassius Clay had already learned by now to be careful of the police, right? This was, a lot of things haven't changed, and it certainly was true in the period we're talking about in 1960. Well, he had his first professional fight October 29 of 1960, and he fought against a cop. This guy here was named Tunney Hunsaker. He was 30 years old at this point. Cassius was still 18. His opponent was 30 years old. He was a police chief in a small town in West Virginia, and suffice to say, Cassius just beat the hell out of that cop. So that's one place you could do it and get away with it, in the boxing ring. And of course, when you're bringing along a young fighter, you don't put him in immediately against the toughest competition. You've got to kind of build his confidence, give him the experience. And so you want to bring him along slowly, especially you have the agenda. Already Clay is thinking that he wanted to be the youngest heavyweight champion in history. Now, early in his career, probably 3 or 4 fights in, he had a fight in Las Vegas. And he went on the radio to promote that fight. And that was when he met a wrestler. They were on the radio together. The wrestler's name was Gorgeous George. You see a book there, The Outrageous Bad Boy Wrestler. And Gorgeous George was very famous in his day. His real name was George Wagner. He had a ring name. And how can I explain? Well, look at the picture on the left. You can see that Gorgeous George's gimmick, if you will. He had this long bleached blonde hair. He would come into the ring wearing hairpins. He would throw them out to the crowd. He had a personal valet who here has a long gown that Gorgeous George would put on as he entered the ring. The valet would help him take the gown off. Then the valet had an atomizer, kind of like a perfume spray bottle, and he would spray it around the ring, spray some of the perfume on Gorgeous George. And the whole idea back in the 50s, when Gorgeous George was famous, is people were convinced he was gay because he was very effeminate. He didn't seem to be very manly. And then once the wrestling match would start, he was a very dirty fighter. He was a villain in the ring. And this is all part of the act. Now, Gorgeous George, if he were gay, that was news to his wife. They had been married for a long, long time. And this was all just part of the act. And so when they went on the radio show, Cassius learned, man, the showmanship, it's so incredibly important to talk it up, right? To talk a lot of smack, to make a lot of people mad, bragging about what you're going to do, you're going to win the fight and all this kind of stuff. And then when he saw Gorgeous George actually wrestle in Las Vegas, he saw that the place was packed, and he realized this is the way to sell a lot of tickets, that I want to be so outrageous that people are going to want to buy a ticket to come and see me get whopped. And so that was an important part of his act, if you will. And I have to say here, too, that early in his career, some of the sports writers, many of whom were kind of old school conservative men, they thought Cassius might be gay. And the reason they thought that was that he was always talking about how pretty he was. He never said he was handsome. He didn't use the more acceptable term. He talked about being so pretty. And another clue they felt was that he didn't really seem to have any interest in women. Well, that's because the old school boxers, thought that sex during training especially is something you should stay away from. I won't go further into the theory as to why, but he had the kind of traditional outlook there that he stuck to his training. He had good nutrition. and the like, and the women were a distraction, and so I think they misread him for that reason. Gorgeous George was a major inspiration. So you get some tougher fighters. This would be in the poster on the left, and this would have been in November of 1962. He fought against Archie Moore. Archie Moore had been the light heavyweight champion years before. He had actually kind of coached Cassius Clay in the gym, but so he fought Archie Moore out in Los Angeles. The problem being Clay at this point was still, let me think about that, he would have been 19, I think, and Archie Moore was 50. So it would have been about like me stepping into the ring. So he knocked out Archie Moore in the 4th round. This would have been in March of 1963. He fought against Doug Jones, and that fight took place in Madison Square Garden in New York City, which is kind of the mecca for professional boxing, and so that's definitely a step up the ladder. And that was a tough fight. Doug Jones was number 3 ranked heavyweight at the time, and when the fight went the whole 10 rounds, and Clay won on a decision on the judges' scorecard, and it was somewhat controversial. Next big fight, you see the poster here, was June 18 of 1963. He flew to London, and they fought in the big football or soccer stadium, Wembley Stadium. They fought there, Cassius Clay versus Henry Cooper, the British champion. You can see all these are touted as eliminating contests. The whole idea is you're climbing the ladder so that eventually you'll get a title fight. And you have to be very careful, you see, not to get too arrogant. This happened at the end of the 4th round with about 2 seconds left in the round. Henry Cooper, who by then was badly cut, it looked like the fight might be ended. Henry Cooper caught Cassius Clay with a left hook and knocked him down. And Clay was knocked down very, very few times in his career, but this is one of the times that really stood out. And he was saved by the bell because the bell rang and there wasn't any count, so he was able to recover, and the fight was stopped in the next round because of that cut that Clay had inflicted. So that was a fight that really stood out. So by now he's ready to fight for the championship by the time we get to late 1963, and this was going to be quite a challenge because the champion was Sonny Liston, and Sonny Liston had taken the belt 1962. You see here again, they used often baseball and football stadiums at Comiskey Park in Chicago that Sonny Liston fought against the champion Floyd Patterson. Now, I remember when my mother would take me downtown to the movie shows like the Metropolitan on Main Street, that there would be newsreels that would come on before the movie. And I heard about how Floyd Patterson had defeated Ingemar Johansson, that he had been the first man to win back the heavyweight crown after Johansson had taken it from him in the prior fight. So Floyd Patterson was obviously, well, he was the heavyweight champion. He was quite highly regarded. But what happened when the fight occurred was that it wasn't much of a fight. There's Sonny Liston standing over Floyd Patterson. He knocked out Floyd Patterson in a little more than 2 minutes of the first round. So what I want to get across about Sonny Liston, who is now the champion, more than anything, is that he was the most feared puncher of his time. He was incredibly intimidating and incredibly strong, and he would often, almost always, knock out his opponents in the first couple of rounds. It was never much of a fight. And when he fought Floyd in the rematch in 1963, he knocked him out in the first round again. You know, if he reminds me of anybody in terms of his fearsomeness as a fighter, his punching power, would be Mike Tyson, because Mike Tyson early in his career, through most of his career, had that same kind of reputation. So this is the guy that Cassius Clay is going to have to beat to get to the heavyweight championship. So here's the poster for the fight. It would occur February 25, 1964. It would be down in Miami Beach, which is where Clay trained, which was a big fight city at that time. And see, there was a big fight. There would be no live coverage on television. It was, you could either, if you weren't live at the fight, and ringside tickets were $200, nosebleed seats $20, you can see in the poster there. You'd have to go to a closed circuit, like to a movie theater, like the ones I referenced downtown, and pay for a ticket there, or you could listen on the radio. And my Uncle Jack and I listened to the fight on the radio in the kitchen of our old house in the East End, and I will never forget that experience. Now, coming into the fight, well, let me just introduce this, that while Cassius was down in Miami training, the Beatles had come to the United States for the first time. They appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show on February 9 of 1964. That would have been, what, about 2 weeks before the fight was going to take place. Now, they played that Sunday night on the Sullivan Show, and they were just a sensation. And the next week, they went down. Sullivan was going to do his show from Miami Beach. So they happened to be there in Miami Beach while Cassius was training, getting ready for the fight. And some publicists had the idea, let's bring him into the gym to meet Cassius Clay. Now, Cassius Clay didn't know who the heck the Beatles were, and they frankly didn't know much about him. But Cassius Clay was already a showman. He knew how important it would be for publicity because he'd heard there was a lot of talk about these guys. So you see them, they're both they're all engaging in the photo here in kind of a slapstick routine where Cassius is hitting, that's George, on top of the head, and he's knocking down everybody else. And one thing that strikes me from the picture is just how big he is. He came into the ring at about 210 pounds. I think he was about, I want to say he was about 6'1", something like that. He's just turned 22 years old. He's in his physical athletic prime. He's certainly entering into that. He probably could have knocked them all down at one time. So I love this picture because it captures Cassius Clay, who becomes Muhammad Ali on the one hand, and the Beatles, some of the just incredibly important cultural figures of the 1960s, right when all of that is taking place. Now, nobody gave Cassius a chance. I mean, all of the odds makers are thinking Sonny Liston is maybe going to kill him. This is going to be a completely one-sided fight. He's just a punk, right? He just talks all this big talk and predicts what round he's going to win in, and there's no really there. And odds, Vegas odds makers had the odds at 7-1 in favor of Liston coming into the fight. And then they had the weigh-in. This is the tradition, the day before the day of the fight itself. And at the weigh-in, Clay just went crazy. You see somebody's holding him back. There are police there. He told Liston he wanted to fight him right then. He'd already gone. He took a busload of people to Sonny's house in Liston a few weeks earlier and was there in Sonny's front yard telling him to come out. I want to fight you right here. Just acting like a complete maniac. And so at any rate, they took his blood pressure and said, my God, his blood pressure was off the charts, his heart rate. The doctor said, this kid is scared to death. And so at any rate, here's a picture I love that Sonny's there on scales and Cassius is right there looking to see what the scales say. And what's going on here is a very conscious part of his plan, that he's conducting psychological warfare. And I think you can see from the look on Sonny's face, he's wondering just what in the hell are you doing here? And it's very scary on one level, but Cassius later said, if you can get somebody to think you're crazy, which is the impression he's giving, then they think you're capable of anything. And that kind of puts that seed of doubt in their minds. And so here's what Cassius Clay at that time said of Sonny. He said, a man with Liston's kind of mind is very funny. He ain't what you would call a fast thinker. He's got one of them bulldog kind of minds. Once he starts to thinking something, he won't let hold of it quick. So that was part of the idea, to get inside of Sonny's head and maybe get him off his game. Now, here's another quote that Clay was fond of that he used around this time. He said, one forgets that though a clown never imitates a wise man, the wise man can imitate the clown. And so that's what's going on here. Yeah, he's playing the fool. He seems to be a clown, but really he's not that at all in reality. And this is a very wise strategy. It turns out that was not an original quote from Cassius Clay. That quote came from Malcolm X. And Malcolm X was very close to Cassius at this time. Cassius had become familiar with the religion that Malcolm X belonged to, the Nation of Islam, which were called the Black Muslims. Back at that time, he had seen them around during when he fought in the Golden Gloves in Atlanta and in Chicago. So he was aware of them for several years, and he liked their what could be called Black nationalism. He liked the fact that they had Black pride, that they believed in self-help. His father, Cassius Clay Sr., had been a follower of Marcus Garvey, and Marcus Garvey preached a back to Africa doctrine back in the 19-teens. So it made sense that the message of the Black Muslims would resonate with Cassius Clay. And so there at the fight that night, Malcolm X was sitting in the seventh row, seat number 7. He thought his mentor Elijah Muhammad, the head of the Nation of Islam, had taught that the number 7 is a lucky number, and he said it's February the 25th, and 2 and 5 added together equals 7. But it goes so much beyond that. That Malcolm believed in Cassius, and he gave him the confidence. When they talked together, they'd become close friends. That yes, you can do this. Nobody believes that you're going to beat Sonny Liston, but I think you can pull this off. The reporter for the New York Times who was at the fight was actually instructed by the New York Times, go and find out the location of the nearest hospital, because when they carry Clay away from the ring in an ambulance, you need to get there and get the scoop, get the full story. But at any rate, hardly anybody believed in Cassius. I have this picture up of Burnett Elementary in the East End because I was a 6th grader in Mr. Bryan's class, and we were all talking about the fight. And the day of the fight, given the fact the odds were 7-1 against Clay, I was the only student in the class who predicted that Cassius Clay would win. And everybody, including Mr. Bryan, laughed at me for making that prediction. So how did the fight go? Well, let's see. That kind of skips ahead. Let's see now if I've got this working right. I'd like to just show you the first minute of the fight. Remember, everybody figured the fight would be over in the first round. This was not going to be any kind of challenge for Sonny Liston. So let's just see what happens in the first minute of the fight. You don't have any volume, I think, but you can hear me, so I'll provide that. So you see, Clay is already dancing in his corner, and he comes out, and Liston misses with the left. And look at that, he missed with the right. Look at what Clay's doing, how he's wheeling, keeping out of range, ducking. Now he throws the left, you see. So he wants to make sure that they're kind of tentative, but he wants to start to make so he's not just running the whole time. And he's watching very closely, looking for an opening. And look at Sonny just relentlessly pursuing him, but he can't cut off the ring. Now, they land a shot to the body there. And again, that you feel that. You have to be in good shape to withstand something like that. Now, look at the left hand. Clay flicks him with the left. Scores point. Look at that. Look at that, how badly Sonny missed in those instances right there. Okay, now look at the left. Look at the jab. You feel that every time. That's a trivial punch. And now to the midsection. And in a second here, let's see him. He got the hand speed, the foot speed. And but again, look at that. That again was just so incredible. Now, what I wanted to stress here was just imagine how exhausting that is for Sonny Liston, the energy it takes to be pursuing someone like that and to miss, and how it begins to get to be very kind of deflating, right? Because you expect I'm going to get in there and just knock this guy out. So let's go to the last part of the first round here. Okay, throwing some combinations, very effective combo, and that's a good right hand. And Sonny's probably wondering now, what have I gotten myself into? One jab after another. Okay, now I'm gonna pause that right there, because if you're at ringside, the judges on the scorecard, is there any doubt as to who won that round? Let's assume the fight goes to the distance and it goes to the judge's decision, right? And does anybody want to say who won that round from what you saw? Is there any real doubt that Cassius Clay? David, I see you there. Is there any doubt who won that round?
Ali won that.
He won that round. How did he win it? Did he get in there and beat Liston up?
No, he won it by not really. He won it by not really letting him get in there and throw punches at him.
Absolutely. I mean, he evaded all the punches, right? And and he knew that Sonny had not trained for a long fight. Sonny assumed it was going to be a quick knockout, right? So his conditioning wasn't at the same kind of level. So Sonny must have really felt he was in for it here. Now, what I want to do is skip ahead. In the third round, Clay cuts Liston. And I remember hearing on the radio when they said that Liston was cut, I couldn't believe it because that was obviously a turning point in the fight. It was going very well for Clay. And then after the third round, when Liston was cut, he came back to his corner, and we still to this day don't know exactly what happened. But the belief is that Sonny and his corner men must have said, maybe we need to juice the gloves. Now, what does that mean? That trainers had tricks, right, to put something on the gloves that would get into the other fighter's eyes. It could well be that the stuff, the liniment they were using to try to close the cuts, maybe the sweat caused it to get into the eyes of Cassius Clay. But at any rate, when Clay comes back to his corner at the end of the fourth round, after that had happened, then something clearly is wrong. And so let's just watch this part of the clip right here.
Oh, here we go. Wait.
See, again, the ring announcers don't know that something is in his eyes, and he is at this point in so much pain and knowing he's blind. He's telling Angelo Dundee, cut my gloves off. So Dundee goes to work. He's got the sponge. He's washing out his eyes. He's got a minute here to take some kind of action. And he's blinking. He's saying, you've got to, this is the heavyweight belt. You can't quit. That's not an option. You can see when he's standing up there that he doesn't want to go back out. He's really, imagine fighting Sonny Liston and not being able to see, right? Having that kind of pain in your eyes. This is the most dangerous moment in the fight at the beginning of the fifth round. Sonny can see that something's wrong with Clay. He could tell that immediately, and he probably knew, what had taken place. So Sonny's going to go all out. Let's watch just about the first minute of the fifth round. And look at Sonny working to the body. And oh my God, you can imagine how those punches must hurt. Any of us would be just completely knocked out by blows like that. Cassius is doing all he can to tie him up, try to evade him, knowing that he's in trouble here, and indeed he is. Sonny knows this is his chance. See how he stuck out that left there just to kind of keep him away. Imagine what must be going through his head at this time, just trying to buy some time and get his vision back. And that was hard punches by Sonny Liston. This is a picture of how Liston's cut in the third round. I already told you about that. And so after the round, I just showed you when Clay survives the round and Liston exhausted himself in trying to knock him out, then he knows it's basically over. They come out and fight the sixth round. Clay is back in control. Before the seventh round started, Sonny Liston told his bench, I'm done. He told his crew, he quit on the stool. It's recorded then as a seventh round technical knockout because he did not answer the bell for the seventh round. Look at this picture here. You can see a fighter who is utterly defeated and utterly spent. And Clay, again, just erupted in the ring. He said, I am the king of the world. He jumped up on the ropes. He was looking at the reporters, all of whom had disrespected him in their writings. And they said, eat your words, eat your words. And so this was a very, very famous scene here. So check out this current movie. I think it's on Amazon Prime, One Night in Miami. And it's based on the fact that that night at a place called the Hampton House Hotel, which a lot of Black people went to because it served Black customers. Not everybody did at that time. That Cassius Clay celebrated that night late into the early morning hours, spending time with from left to right. That's Jim Brown of the Cleveland Browns, the great running back. Malcolm X was there, and the great singer Sam Cooke was there as well. And they had all been at the fight. So I urge you to check out that movie. Notice a Black woman, Regina King, directed. It was nominated for the Golden Globes, for the Oscars, various kinds of nominations and what have you. One of the students said she loved it, and I highly recommend it. So it captures that time. Now, people wondered, they couldn't wait for the rematch. They thought that Clay's victory had been a fluke. What I've neglected to say was the next morning after he knocked out Liston, after he beat Sonny, Then the very next morning, of course, all the kids had to recognize my genius as a fight prognosticator in school. The next day, I couldn't wait to go. The next morning, he announced that he was a member of the Nation of Islam, that his name would be Cassius X. Clay was his slave name, and now he would be Cassius X. And about a month later, Elijah Muhammad gave him his new name of Muhammad Ali. Now, there were a lot of sports writers, again, white men, old school, who refused to call him by his new name. People change their names all the time, but they still called him Clay, and it was a mark, believe you me, of disrespect. So when Muhammad Ali now fought against Sonny Liston the following year, May of 1965, the result was a first-round knockout that Sonny Liston walked right into a short right-hand punch, just caught him right on the cheekbone, and he was down like a sack of potatoes. And people couldn't believe it. And that's one of the most iconic photos in all sports history that we see that resulted when Sonny hit the deck. So he beat Sonny Liston, and now he was the king of the world. And this is a great book by David Remnick, and I recommend highly this book, To the Devil and Sonny Liston by Nick Tosches. And can we have some sympathy for the devil? Because people always saw Sonny as the villain, and Cassius Clay was implying, of course, that Sonny wasn't very smart. And here's what a great, great writer, James Baldwin, said about Sonny Liston. James Baldwin was black, who grew up in Harlem, and he was gay. And I think he brought a gay man's insights into a lot of what he had to say. And he said of Sonny, whom he had interviewed and hung around with, he is far from stupid. He is not, in fact, stupid at all. And while there's a great deal of violence in him, I sense no cruelty at all. On the contrary, he reminded me of big black men I have known who acquired the reputation of being tough in order to conceal the fact that they weren't hard. Anyone who cared could turn them into taffy. Anyway, I liked him very much. And Al, it just raises to me that whole question the Men's Center talks about is, what is masculinity? Some of us feel that to be real men, we have to seem to be so tough and so hard and the like. And that's not really what manhood is all about, that there's a lot to be said for having empathy. And that's what James Baldwin, he's being empathetic in regard to his feelings about Sonny Liston. Sonny Liston ended up dead in his house in Las Vegas in 1971 from a heroin overdose. Speculation that the mob killed him because maybe he owed too much money or had not taken a dive in a fight. And so he had a very, very sad demise. He'd had a hard life, a very tragic life in many ways. All right, so now Ali was the champion, and it all came undone right here in Houston on April 28, 1967, when he refused to go into the armed forces. He was drafted, and he said, I am a conscientious objector. I'm a Muslim minister. He didn't want to go into the army. I think that was basically it. He didn't want to go and fight in Vietnam. And he famously said to the press, he said, let me see, I want to find the exact quote here. He said, hold on just a minute here. Yes, I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong. And so he became a hero to the students, especially the young men who also did not support the Vietnam War. By 1967, we knew there were problems with our objectives and how the war was going. Spent a lot of time on this in History 1302. And I have to say, it reminds me a lot of this guy right here. And I don't have to say much more about that, that when you have a black athlete who has a high profile and he takes a stance that people think is unpatriotic, in their minds, it's not the right perspective, then it'll cost you. It costs you in terms of the public condemnation, and it costs you in terms of your career. And just like Colin Kaepernick, it's been how many years now that he's better than a lot of quarterbacks in the NFL, but nobody wants to hire him. And Muhammad Ali, because of his anti-war, because of his refusal, because of his draft defiance, he could not fight for the next 3.5 years, which is some of the prime of his life in athletics. Now, when he did come back 50 years ago this month, March 8, 1971, by then the champion was Joe Frazier. And Joe Frazier was a tough fighter, Smoking Joe from Philadelphia. And it was a close fight. It was a hard fight. But in the 15th round, when it was still, maybe the fight could have gone either way on some of the scorecards, Joe Frazier knocked Ali down, and it cost Ali the round and may well have cost him the fight. So Frazier was the champion, and what Ali couldn't wait for was to get a rematch against Frazier so he could win back the championship against him. Well, it turned out that Frazier wasn't the champion all that much longer, because He was defeated in 1973 by George Foreman from Houston, from the 5th Ward, who had won the gold medal in heavyweight rank in 1968. And George Foreman was big and strong and an incredibly intimidating fighter. And when he fought Joe Frazier, he knocked Joe Frazier down 6 times, and the fight was stopped in the 2nd round because Frazier just came at it, and Foreman was a whole lot stronger, and it was an annihilation. So Ali was going to have to go through Frazier before he could get a title fight, and that happened January 28 of 1974. This is Ali Frazier Part 2. It was a 12-round fight. It went the distance, and Ali won a pretty clear-cut decision. It was a tough fight, but Ali did come out on top. And what that leads to now a little bit later in 74 is what's billed as the Rumble in the Jungle, which would occur in Zaire in Africa, which was a country that had been the Congo, the Belgian Congo. New African president Mobutu gave it a new name and wanted to kind of put the country on the map. So he staged, offered his country, Kinshasa, Kinshasa, Zaire, the capital, to be the site of the fight. And you can imagine the coverage, the global coverage that would get. Check out this documentary that won the Academy Award, When We Were Kings. When it came out in the mid-90s, it won the Academy Award. It won the Oscar for Best Documentary. And it's about this whole aspect of the story. And there we see Muhammad there in Africa, and it explains and shows how he was idolized by the Africans for a variety of reasons. And this book by Malcolm Gladwell, David and Goliath, becomes so relevant. They see the subtitle, The Art of Battling Giants, because one thing you want to make sure you do when you fight against the giant and you are the David in the contest is never fight the giant on his own terms. You see, that's what David refused to do. Saul offered David his armor and his sword, but David said, I don't need all that. That's not the way I fight. I'm a slinger. That was his strength. So that's a good lesson for all of you. You fight to your strengths, right? And you have to kind of use your mind to come up with a strategy to defeat the giant. Rather, if you go at him directly, if you try to punch him into submission, you're the one who's going to get knocked out. So what Ali did was to employ a tactic called the rope-a-dope. Now, Foreman's the young man in his 20s. Ali, is the guy in his early 30s, and people, again, were predicting. Some thought that Foreman might actually kill him in the ring. And what Ali did was to lean on the ropes. For people wondered, what in the world is he doing? He would let Foreman punch him. We see Foreman working to the middle, and he would work to the head. And Ali's got his gloves up, and a lot of the punches are picked off by the gloves and land on his arms. But man, that hurts. Some of those punches are getting through. So it's not just anybody who could do this. But what happened was it was a brilliant strategy. Foreman punched himself out, and in the 8th round, Ali came off the ropes. He hit Foreman once. He could see that Foreman was stunned, that he was ready to go. And man, he threw a lightning fast combination, and George Foreman was down for the count. And so he had to regain the heavyweight belt as a result of the Rumble in the Jungle. Now he gives Frazier, this is the 3rd fight, title match in 1971. This is, again, it's Don King, the promoter who comes up with all these snappy titles, the Thriller in Manila. And that fight, was scheduled for 15 rounds. Joe Frazier could not answer the bell for the 15th round. His corner stopped the fight. Both of his eyes were swollen shut. Ali later said this was the closest I ever came to dying. It was just a brutal, brutal fight. And we don't have 15-round fights anymore. Now a championship fight lasts 12 rounds, because the research has shown that it's when two men are fairly evenly matched, it's in the late rounds, say past the 10th round, that the real damage is done. You see, if I fought against Joe Frazier, I wouldn't get killed, because the first time Joe Frazier hit me, I'd be knocked out and the fight would be over. But if you're in there slugging it out with him for a fight of that length, that's when the real damage is done. And it's the cumulative blows to the head. And I think we can see this Thriller in Manila was a sign looking back that Ali just fought too long. He fought his last fight in 1981, and by then he had suffered so much punishment. It was because he was so courageous in the ring. He wouldn't quit it. He could take a punch. You saw what he absorbed from Sonny Liston. He didn't easily go down. And what that meant was he took so much punishment over the course of a long ring career, and it resulted in his having Parkinson's disease, which is a degenerative disease, and that's what made him eventually a semblance of himself and would take his life. So this is about 20 years later. This was one of the iconic moments in Atlanta in 1996. By now, I think he had moved to Atlanta, if I'm not mistaken, but it's a great city as far as Black Americans and as far as our country is concerned. And they were hosting the Olympics, and Ali lit the Olympic torch in the opening ceremonies. He was shaking. He was shaking probably for nervousness, but he was shaking especially because of the Parkinson's. An estimated 3 billion people saw him worldwide. People were tuned in from everywhere, and it was one of those incredible moments. I think people wondered, is something horrible going to happen? Is he going to drop the torch? But he was able to pull it off, and it was one of those moments. And I recollect reading he couldn't sleep the rest of that night. He was so pumped up on the adrenaline from pulling that off and, surmounting the challenge that it was something that he would never forget. And then in 2005, and this is what Al talked about, that the people, I don't think I got it across strongly enough, but back when he became the champion, a lot of people hated Cassius Clay Muhammad Ali. He was a black kid, a black man who just talked too much, and it rubbed white people, conservative white people, the wrong way. Of course, a kid like me who was becoming very rebellious and critical in my thinking, that's exactly what I liked. And so that really spoke to my perspective as I was moving into my later teens and moving into my college years. That first fight against Frazier took place when I was a freshman at the University of St. Thomas, and I remember everybody was talking about that fight. I don't think we follow boxing the same way today that we did back then, but everybody was tuned in and had strong feelings about who they wanted to win. And of course, I wanted Ali every single time. So things had changed, though, by 2005. And here's President Bush, who's giving Ali the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He would have been in his mid-60s by this time. And what had changed, I think people felt more sympathy for him because of his struggles against Parkinson's. But I think most important, the country had changed and people had reassessed a lot of their feelings. So this is a measure of it here. Then he died in 2016, and oh my God, what a funeral procession and what a funeral it was. And look at the signs, he's still pretty. A sign that says, "Thanks, we love you, Ali and family." I can't make out the other one. The print is too fine, but you can see it's a lot of black people, but a lot of white people in the crowd as well. And anyway, paying tribute to the man who I would argue, and there's his years there, was indeed the greatest of all time. He was the best fighter I ever saw, and he was an inspiration in many other ways. And I said I couldn't help but reference this at the end of talking about sports, and that's my Cougs that are still in the tournament. And, in terms of being a real man and not sitting on the bench and getting in there and giving it everything for your team. We saw a performance against Rutgers in the game on, I guess it was Sunday. And this is a young man from New Orleans on the right by the name of Dejan Giroux. And he had a hip pointer and he was clearly in pain, but by God, he left it all out there, and he helped his team pull off a pretty remarkable win in just the last couple of minutes, really the last few seconds. Okay, so that's what I got. So what I'm going to do is close this out. I always like to get to this point where I can get stuff off the screen. And now we got you guys here. And I'd like to hear, now I can see who's with us here. And so we got some time for some feedback. So give me some questions, some thoughts on Muhammad Ali. What do you have to tell me? Anybody?
Okay. Yes, guys, the floor is open for you to ask questions. Anybody have any questions? Any questions? I know you have some questions. Again, thank you, Professor Davis, as they formulate their questions. If you do not want to ask them, but you want to type them in the chat, you can do that right down at the bottom, or you can unmute yourself and ask your question. But while you guys are thinking about your questions, I had a few questions I wrote down. I always do this.
Go ahead, Al, please.
Professor Davis, I noticed that you named a couple of the fights, Drill in Manila, you named Rumble in the Jungle. Was that pretty popular back then? And why was it so popular back then? I guess that would be the question.
Well, that's a good. Boxing always had been. I think going back to the late 19th century that it had big following. But then, Al, I'd have to say when television came along and people started, typically most families had a TV set. Boxing was good on television because you could see everything there, just like when I showed you the part of the fight there. You could see it on the screen, and I think so. It translated well. There used to be speaking about masculinity. There used to be the Friday night fights. I forget which network it was, where my Uncle Jack and I would always watch the Friday night fights, and it was sponsored by Gillette. So the whole idea was this is a man's sport, and it's a very elemental sport that everyone can understand because, and that's the downside of boxing. Frankly, it's about beating up your opponent and hopefully winning the fight, getting the fight stopped, or knocking him out, or whatever. So I think again that. There were fewer competing entertainment forms. Life was different in the 50s and the 60s. I think what happened to Al that really has undermined boxing is that now there's so many different championship belts that at times we've had 3 or 4 different heavyweight champions or champions in other weight divisions, because that way everybody can have a championship fight. There's a championship fight coming up all the time. And that's diluted things. It used to be there was one heavyweight champion, and the heavyweight belt has always been the big things because the big men are the the most fun to watch. They're going to get in there and you're going to likely see somebody get knocked out. So I think it was just a different time, and that boxing was still a lot more popular back then than it is today. Yeah.
I would like to think too, I don't know if it's totally true, but my mind says part of it was marketing to get people to want to listen on the radio, also wanting to watch on TV. Part of that, whole let's see what this is about, the Thriller in Manila. Let's see what this is about, the Rumble in the Jungle type thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's so much of that of just genius in terms of, you're right, of marketing and advertising that's involved. There was a great promoter back in the 20s in the era of Jack Dempsey, who was Tex Rickard was his name, and he was just famous for always you promote the fight. Jack Dempsey one time fought against the French champion Carpentier, and so it's okay, let him go in and beat up this Frenchman here. He's fighting against a foreigner. That Jack Dempsey had evaded military service himself during World War One. Carpentier was a war hero. So find some hook, right, to kind of get people all fired up about the fight. And Don King, of course, was the genius. Those phrases I mentioned, the Rumble in the Jungle, the Thrill in Manila. If you've seen Don King, he had this hairdo. It looked like he had an electric shock, and he was the fight promoter who was behind a lot of this. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. Anyone have any questions yet? Any questions at all? David, anybody? Donna?
I have some feedback. Thank you,
Okay.
Professor Davis, for putting this on, and to you as well, Alfred. Really appreciate it. I have a great story. When I was a kid, my family and I met Muhammad Ali and his wife at the time back in 1979 at the Gander International Airport, which is up in Canada. We were traveling around that summer, coming back from I think a military trip, and he and his wife were in the airport at the time, and my mother happened to recognize him, and she basically let the cat out of the bag and kind of cried out in the airport, "Look, everybody, it's Muhammad Ali." And of course, by that, you announce that anywhere, and it's going to draw a crowd. But I was about 9 at the time, 9 or 10, and I can vividly remember kind of us standing there, looking at Muhammad Ali and his wife. And I have 2 younger sisters, and my dad, shook his hand and stuff. And of course, these days, everybody would have their phone out. So I don't have visual documentation. We got a couple autographs, but I do remember Muhammad Ali, like kind of looking down at my younger sisters, and they had these coloring books or something, and him kind of, saying something to them at the time. But, at that point, it's still a story we talk about today. It's just one of those where, unfortunately I remember the event. I was too young to really know at the time, but just the presence, and then everybody kind of swarmed in and drew a crowd, and I'm sure they weren't all that thrilled about it, but they were very gracious. They talking for a few minutes and stuff, and very, very interesting. 30, 40 years later to kind of see this. So when I saw this come up in my email, I thought, oh, I really like to join this and hear what you have to say, Professor. So thank you. It's a story I'll never forget. Again, our family talks about it all the time. It's truly one of a kind. I'm sure everyone that's ever had a similar event, recalls it fondly. So thank you.
You're welcome. And, I never was that lucky. I told somebody the other day, I forget when it was, maybe back in the 90s, that I was in a hotel somewhere and the word was everywhere that Ali had been through there about 10 minutes earlier. So that was a near miss. But you could still tell from the buzz of the people who had seen him and the like, the electricity around any encounter like that. Greg, by the way, I have to say, you outed yourself. You're a Canadian. I don't think there's yeah. And I don't know if the others picked up on the accent. And there was a great Canadian champion. You might ask your parents if they remember George Chuvalo. Ali fought him twice, and Chuvalo was one of those fighters who could just absorb the punishment. He was never knocked down in his entire ring career, and he went the distance twice against Muhammad Ali. I remember one fight where supposedly after the fight, George Chuvalo's kids said something like, well, why didn't Daddy win the fight? And the mother said, well, because Mr. Clay hit Daddy more than Daddy hit Mr. Clay.
Yeah, I do remember. I do recognize the name, the Chuvalo. Yep. Yeah, I do recognize that.
Yeah, exactly. We called him Chuvalo. So yeah, he was the great Canadian champion of that era. Did any of the rest of you remember seeing Ali fight? I can't see my entire audience and know how old you are. Al, Dave. Al, I think you're a little too young to remember his career. Am I right about that? Unmute, Al.
Yeah, I saw at least 4 or 5 of his fights, actually.
Okay. Yeah, so you remember, some of the fights in the 70s, certainly.
I was a little kid, but yeah.
Yeah. And I think, again, to have seen Ali fight in his prime, he was incredible. I mean, in terms of course, he got older. And the older he got, the more he used to have his intelligence in the ring. It had to be more of a strategy. But he was always very artful in terms of that aspect of boxing. Yeah.
And I think Ali for that time was larger than life. You didn't see many people doing what he did in their sport. He was really the precursor for a lot of what we see today, whether it be in wrestling, or other sports, entertainment, professional sports. He was really early for his time.
Yes, I think you're right about that, Greg. There's a line. It was voiced by a certain person on one of the networks, and that is, it was directed to LeBron James, that shut up and dribble. So the whole idea that these athletes, and it's funny how it almost always turns out to be black athletes, they need to shut up, right? Just to be quiet and just play your sport. But we know that's not. They have influence, and LeBron really stands out in that way. They have a voice, and there are things they want to talk about, and there are things they want to try to make better. And so I don't hold that against them to use their voices, but you still see a lot who resent that. And some of that happened back in the 60s with Muhammad Ali. Definitely, he was a precursor in that respect. Okay, anything else, guys?
I wanted to add something here, and maybe, Professor, you can give me your take on this. I noticed that Muhammad Ali would really say a lot of bad things about the other fighters, but it wasn't mean. It was kind of funny. Like he really played with words a lot. And I love the part when he used to say, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. And he made these little rhymes and poems. What do you think that came from? Was it an intimidation factor for the other boxers? Or what do you think? Where do you think that came from?
Well, I think he was a natural at that. Somebody said he was one of the first rappers, and concerning those rhymes he would make. Now, Al, as you know, there's a long tradition in African American culture about the dozens. It's having certain verbal skills. It comes out of the slavery experience when your powers were limited, and so and of course you were in most cases illiterate. You weren't allowed to learn to read, and so the oral communication became very important. And I think that's something that black men, it's part of the culture. I haven't experienced that myself for obvious reasons, but I've read a lot about that, and so I think that whole idea of just kind of having these verbal joust, right? And some are better. And you see the rappers, of course, the ones who have that talent to do freestyle composition. You have to have a quick mind. You have to have a good vocabulary and a quick mind, and not everybody can do that. So it's a way of bettering your opponent. You don't have to hit him. You can kind of out-talk him. So I think that's where a lot of that came from. And I think you're right, Al, a lot of it was the show. He later fought a fight against Floyd Patterson. and he was talking all the smack and putting Floyd down and all that. But then after the fight, you know, he was comforting the Patterson. The fight was stopped in the 12th round, and you know, because he really cared about him. I mean, he knew Floyd. The word was that he knew Floyd had some money problems, and he wanted to give him a fight to help him get out of some of his debt. And so some of that it's not personal. It was all part of the show.
Okay, we have a question in the chat box. It says, do you think the darker skinned fighters such as Joe Frazier would have been revered the same way as Ali if he had his accomplishments?
Okay, now Donna, that's kind of a minefield, but I think it's an important question all the same. Was there something about Muhammad Ali that made him more acceptable to white people, say, than certain black fighters would have been? And the issue of skin color could be a factor there. So it's true that it's just something sadly embedded in our culture that that black has this air of menace to it. When you combine that with a fighter like Sonny Liston, who was darker skinned, who had served time in prison, who had this real tough guy image, it made it harder to really like him and root for him, unless you just hated Cassius Clay so much for the reasons I've gotten into, that you would root for that guy. You would root for anybody that he fought against. So I think that, yeah, it would have been tougher for Joe Frazier for a number of reasons. He wasn't going to be able to be the kind of talker, to have those verbal skills I talked about, to promote himself the way that that Ali did. And so it's a number of things. But the issue of skin color, it could well be. Donna, do you want to say something about that? Do you think that that was a factor?
I just wanted to hear your take, but I definitely think it was a factor. They didn't appreciate him, you know, in terms of how he was bragging about himself, which, you know, that will never be accepted necessarily. But I think he was more palatable because of his skin color.
Yeah. And that's an important issue. We talked about, we had that during Black History Month, we had the program of natural hair. And so the whole idea, what is good hair, right? And the same thing, that there definitely has been that trend in history, because look, what did Malcolm X say? He said a lot of black men and black women have been brainwashed by the white culture to think there's something wrong with blackness. There's something wrong with your African features. There's something wrong with the texture of your hair, this kind of thing. And we got to get past that. But that's been an ongoing issue. And I know within the black community itself, that has been an ongoing a bone of contention. I think I'm right about that. Again, I have to be careful because I'm speaking from the perspective of an outsider. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're almost done. I guess it's more of a statement, and somewhat would ask that you would say something on it. But I remember this move called the rope-a-dope.
Yeah.
And can you explain that? The students probably have heard it before, but help them understand what that means.
Okay. First of all, to lean back on the ropes and to let the other fighter wear himself out, exhaust himself punching you. Again, you know, you have to be really good to do that, because a lot of people would get hurt by the punches, right? And the strategy would obviously fail. So the rope, but also the dope, I guess the point being, the other fighter's kind of a dope for falling into the trap, right? Of thinking he's going to beat you that way. And that's kind of how that happened. He had another great move called Ali Shuffle. And that's where he just kind of shuffle his feet and then throw a combination. He had a lot of these tactics that were kind of unique.
Showmanship.
Yeah, showmanship. And the whole idea of rope-a-dope, I'm sure, Al, that he came up with that rhyming phrase. And it's the obvious thing that's going to stick with you if you're familiar with that fight. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, well, I enjoyed it, folks. I hope you learned something. I want to be careful to not try to cram too much in. And so the result is I kind of probably went kind of fast. Did you like, by the way, let me end on this point I just had. Did you like seeing some of the fight footage? Was that useful?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, it helps. It's nice.
And I think now you can go to YouTube and you can see all the fights. Go back and look if you want to at the 8th round of the fight with Foreman, the Rumble in the Jungle, and just see what happened. It's only going to take you about 2.5 minutes. And just watch it, and it'll be really good. David,
Since we're on the topic of boxing, I know they're both old fighters, but are you interested in watching the Tyson versus who is it? It's a Tyson.
Buster Douglas, not that one, huh?
No, it's Tyson and The one he bit his ear off.
Oh,
Holyfield.
Evander Holyfield. Yeah.
Holyfield. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're fighting
Holyfield. No, David, I wouldn't be interested in that. They're both too old. That's just a spectacle. That's just a gimmick.
Yeah.
They're just too old. It's not a real fight. We've had some fighters like George Foreman who are able to do some fairly remarkable things, and people with conditioning and nutritional approaches and the like now can be effective at. Look at what's his name, Tom Brady, an obvious example. We've never seen people play with that effectiveness to that age, but there's a limit after a while, and it just becomes too much. Yeah. Well, and I wish, frankly, Ali had quit earlier. But that's the problem, guys, in life and in sports, is knowing when to stop. I've told my colleague Al, after all these years, let me know when you begin to see me losing it. Right? If you begin to see those signs, let me know. I don't want to stay beyond my time.
Yeah, and that's pretty hard to watch too. I've seen Sugar Ray and a few others do that. But yeah, thanks again for this great talk, Professor Davis. Thank you, students, for being here, and staff that are here. We look forward to doing more of these things. I know we're used to seeing each other in person, but we have to go virtual for right now. But hopefully soon we'll be coming back face to face.
Be sure to follow us on social media at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Like this video, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button to be notified about our latest content.